I am so happy to see you. I am so happy that it's been like many a month, many a year of us trying to figure this out. But, it kind of got to say, it actually started with you, Patty, where I was like, no, we have to do like an expert series. And I feel like we'll start with Patty.
Oh, wow, I'm so honored. Thank you. I think that what I'm remembering right now is I think the last time we were on something like this was right when COVID started. Remember when the whole thing started and we did an IG live
Yes.
and it was like the eruption was happening. So it's good to see you again in a
It's so good to
different
see
in a
you.
different chapter.
Yeah. Yeah. You know what? I think I got to, I think I had a 5 month old,
You did.
and that was the one and only time I've ever really like told my birth story
You
outside of
did.
friends. So
Yeah, yeah, no, and we have to, I feel like we should definitely re-record that
yeah, I
and
love it.
formally have it because I'm going to be having birth stories on the UMA app and on the platform so that people could listen to, and I'd love to have you share your story.
I would love it because I loved my daughter's birth so much. I think I felt like I had been waiting my whole life to have that birth. And when
Yeah.
I had that birth, I can remember saying out loud to my husband, within like 24 hours of that birth, like, I can die now. It's totally okay. I feel like I can actually die peacefully. And he's like, please don't say that. Here with this baby. But it really, and I think some people no, they feel it, and that was so not my experience with my son's birth and my first go at birth.
Yeah.
But I didn't lose faith, and there was something in me that knew I was going to have that most incredible, exhilarating, like God moment of birth. Which is not to say that it's not painful, but it's still the best experience of my life. And I got it. So that's kind of why I really want to hear from you and have you talk about all of these things, because it was hearing other people's birth stories and reading everything I could from Ina May Gaskin and other, incredible birth workers that got me to pull out of the story of my own birth, which was a cesarean and not celebrated, and pull out of the narrative that we generally have around birth, which has changed so much thanks to you and your friends. But yeah, it's these stories. It's these stories that we hear, and you never know when you're going to hear them and who you're going to hear them from and how old you are when you have them, whether you've birthed before or about to birth. But for me at least, and I hear from so many people, it's like that's what gives you faith, whether it's for your next birth or a friend's birth or your daughter's birth, that there is another experience to tap into.
Yeah, it all starts at birth, right? And yet it's it's not supported. Birth is not, I think so much of it begins from the fear that's instilled in us as young girls from the minute we start learning about our bodies. So we really have to sometimes rewind. If when we're growing up, we are not seeing positive birth models and we're not making positive brain imprints and brain models for what birth can be like, or even before then in our bodies, all the magic that we have within our bodies, we have this internal clock and system and intuitive receptors that are really telling us how to care for ourselves, and we are taught to ignore it or to suppress it or to hate it or it's a nuisance. When we think about what our sex education is like here in this country, it's really fear-based, and it's like, don't don't get pregnant and don't get an STD, but we're not really invited into the magic of our bodies. So I think that it starts from there. It starts from us trying to shut down something in our bodies that is really an inconvenience to regular life. And so there's not this invitation for us as young girls and for boys. I think it's important for all of us to be able to learn more about birth, because one thing that every single one of us share in common, no matter how we identify, is that we all grow in a mother's body. We all grow in the womb space, whether we know that mother, love that mother, never knew her, don't care for her. We know that that is one shared experience that we all have as humans, is that we all grow in mother. That is our origin. It is our first home of consciousness becoming physical body and becoming individual self. So, I feel like we all want to be able to give a contribution in this journey that we have to the world. And for me, I'm like, well, I'm going to start from the very beginning. I'm going to start with mother, because if we do not understand how we're born and how we grow in the womb and what's going to make a more optimal environment for each of us to grow in, then we can't have reverence for everything that we are. There has to be reverence for mother before anything that we do. And it doesn't have to be for your mother, but it's simply to understand, oh, okay, so I grew in a womb space, and whatever my mother was experiencing, her stress chemistry or her bliss chemistry was my soundtrack. It was my vibe. It was the atmosphere that I was growing in. And that's not acknowledged, and it's not supported here, especially in this country. So that's what I spend a lot of my time focused on, is really inviting mothers into that space. And even before we conceive, starting to explore what is it like inside this body? What is it like? How can I make this body a more hospitable place for myself to be in and for myself to connect with and to associate with, before I even start making a home for another human?
So we have received hundreds of questions from our community for you. And so
I saw that.
And organized them and compiled them. So I feel really familiar with them. And maybe what we'll do is, rather than go to them all at the end, I kind of feel like we can weave them into conversation. And I'm thinking of all the questions, and then I'll get my own things in there too, but I'm thinking of all the questions we received around conception prep. And so I think a lot of them were around physicality, but I think that you can really share a lot about, you mentioned stress chemistry and bliss chemistry, and what does your body feel like inside? So what are your recommendations for conception prep? And this could be like a year before you start trying. And within that, I would say so there's like the physical questions around conception prep. I want you to definitely talk about the stress and the emotional and some tips there. And then our community is really hot on spirit babies. And so we've had some questions as to how you call the babies in and communicate before they're in your body. So I'll let you take it from there.
All right. Well, let's start from your first portion of the question. Before even, I think we have to let's rewind even before conception. Let's talk about inviting our kids and our girls to, like I said, understand their bodies better, honor their cycles, have communication. The body's always listening. I'll start by saying, and again, I'm going to give you an answer from the lens of my my background as a teacher of Vedic meditation, my background as a teacher of yoga, my background as a mother, and as a doula. These are the pieces that kind of will shape my answer. Consciousness is continually conceiving and constructing and governing this body. My state of mind, if we want to simplify that word, is doing that. So starting with the relationship you have with your body, the love you have for your body, the celebration you have your body, the way that you feed your body, the way that you care for it when it needs rest, the way that you tune into it when you're not feeling good. Just even starting to turn the lens inward. You know, I think when we're little, when we don't feel good, our parent may not, some parents may, but we don't really say, well, just take a moment and tune in. What do you think that you need? Do you think you need to stay home? Do you need to think, you know, we're not really guided inward. It's usually outward. Let me have someone else tell me what I need. Let me have someone else tell me what to do. So that's already it starts at a very young age. So to start, for parents listening to this, let yourself be curious to have that inquiry with your children. They know a lot. We know a lot. We oftentimes know what we need, but that has to be nurtured. That relationship with self and with body has to be nurtured. As we start getting older, or we start thinking about conception, and you know, I think it's like we don't want to wait to that point to start managing our stress. We want to be mindful that stress corrodes and creates inflammation and shuts the body down in many ways. And if we're not removing that stress from our body continually, the vehicle is not going to perform optimally. It's like if we put tons and tons of bricks in the trunk of the car will function, but it will use up more gas, and it will break down more often, and it will need to go to the shop more often. This is my vehicle that big self gets to travel in. This is big self in body form. And so I want to start treating my body that way, and the body will respond to me that way. So for me, everything starts at that level of consciousness, because when I am starting to remove stress from the psychophysiology, from the body and mind, which is really one, then those decisions I make are going to be different. The decision of saying, like, you know what, I'm actually not going to take that job because it's not good for my health. You know, I'm actually going to end that relationship because it's not good for my well-being. You know what, I'm actually going to eat that food because it feels better when I eat it. You start to actually have this communication with nature in a different way. So to me, it's less about tell me what to do, because there's not one right answer for everybody. There's your answer. My passion and my mission is to help you tune into that voice from the inside. And that voice, when you start tuning into it, may say, you know what, I really don't want to have kids. Maybe it's not for you. That's another thing, that it's like, you have to be a mother. You don't have to be a mother. You can be a mother in many ways. So before we even get to that, tuning into what is right for me and what's the right path for me. So that's first and foremost. Then as we do step onto that path of saying, okay, preconception, yes, definitely have a technique and the practices in your life that help you continually remove stress from your body. Not every week, preferably daily. If it's not Vedic meditation is for me and maybe for you, but it may not be for everybody. For me, that's a simple daily practice, like emptying my bowels and brushing my teeth. Both of those practices help me remove toxins and bacteria from my body. My meditation practice twice daily helps me remove accumulated stress from this body so that its functionality is more optimal, so that its interaction is more optimal, and so that my antenna is plugged into nature and I have a direct relationship with nature that way. But for many people, it may be another type of meditation, or it may be going into nature and communing with nature, getting your feet into the earth, working with the earth, I mean, even just laughing and doing what you love, listening to music. being in communion with something bigger than small self is really, really key. And what happens oftentimes is we get to this point of like, why am I not getting pregnant? And we start to kind of narrow those walls in of let me control it and let me try it. And we have really great support from the medical system for all of this. But my invitation is let's actually go to the source. Let's start looking at what's your life like? What is your daily life like? How much time do you spend on a device like this? How can we start to tailor your life so that it's more receptive and more interactive with everything around?
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know if I'm exactly answering your question, but we have to go back to
You are.
what's speaking to this body. This body is a beautiful servant. It is the most intelligent servant. It wants to serve you, but it's listening and feeling. My eyes are connected to my brain, so everything I see and hear and read goes right in here and into all of this. And if there's a lot of fear coming through, the body is going to say, nope, I'm not going to do that, because we have a really intelligent nervous system that says fight or flight or freeze when things are not safe. And it says stay and play and rest and digest when it does feel safe and loved and in alignment. And so the nervous system for me and the state of consciousness is where it starts.
And I think that's very much this community. And so it's really, and that's why you're here. We value that so much. You know, some people will give the answer of like carrots and flax seeds, and it gets very technical, and there's a place for that. But
I mean, but all of that, I think that to me, there are so many pathways to become a mother. And yes, there is, you know, some people will say paleo, some people will say Ayurvedic, some people will say vegetarian. The truth is I don't know what's best for you. We are not one all made the same. But what I do know is that we start removing stress every day and you make that a priority in your life, the intuition is going to be there and it's going to say, hey, I need that cup of bone broth, even if I'm a vegetarian, or it's going to say, hey, I'm actually going to start eating more Ayurvedic foods. It's going to tell you what you need. And so there's less of a right or wrong. I will not subscribe to the shaming or that it has to be this way on our path to motherhood. It's a hard enough job as it is, and there's many, many pathways. And sometimes the hardest pathway is when we have to actually surrender our preferences and go take a different route. Like your first birth that you were talking about, that birth was perfectly orchestrated for who you were at that time and the relationship with your child that was coming through. And so the sophisticated lens for me is let's not diminish the good and bad or right or wrong or should or shouldn't. Everything is happening in your favor for your expansion. Let's get in the driver's seat of that journey so that we can look at it through different lenses.
Or the passenger seat?
The driver's seat, because you are the universe. You're not the universe is not outside of me. I am the universe. I am that cosmic intelligence. It doesn't mean I'm controlling it. I just need to know that I am it. And so
like the driver's seat of a Tesla and autopilot.
Kind of, yes. Yeah, because the autopilot is you tuning into nature. You not having to be like, I gotta control this. When you're plugged in, the GPS is going to guide you where you need to go. And some of those decisions are hard to make.
Yeah. And what about spirit babies? And what about communicating with your baby before they're in your body? I know I certainly had a big experience of that. And yeah, I'm just hearing from a lot of people that are excited about that and want to know more about that, and maybe even looking for tips to kick off some of that communication.
So I think that the way that I look at it is there are definitely souls. The jiva is definitely choosing where to come in, and there is a karmic entanglement in it all. I Not that I don't believe in tuning into that. I think that when we start to remove stress and when we start to meditate more and tune inward more and commune more with nature, we do heighten that receptivity to the soul of our baby, maybe when it's already within us and expanding past that 4-month point, or maybe it's before they've even arrived. The way that I see it is, I think that we can allow ourselves to be a little less attached to it, and let it inspire us, but know that I guess what I'm trying to say is I do believe that the soul is there, and there is a, it's all going to happen in perfect alignment, but sometimes the soul's journey is here to accomplish something that it needed to get through, and sometimes that looks like a short journey, and sometimes it looks like a longer journey, and that's beyond our control. And sometimes that looks like a pregnancy that starts and ends halfway through. And so maybe that was the journey for that soul. That was what they needed to accomplish. And it was a karmic experience that we needed to have together. And so, yes, definitely, I think that the more that it is important to tune in, but I also feel like some people come to me often and they're like, I can't feel a connection to my baby. And they start to feel like there's something wrong if they don't have that. And I don't think that that's necessarily true. Some of us have a heightened connection to the soul that's coming in, and some of us don't. So for me, it's less about calling in that perfect experience, and it's more about making myself that experience. Because again, there's that sense of control. There's a lot of control oftentimes when we start calling in. I'm more into saying, trust that nature is always organizing in your favor, always, even when things don't look so good, and even when they, look great, nature's organizing. My job is to constantly be plugging my antenna into that space.
Yeah.
And that way, again, like you said, I'm not trying to control the steering wheel all the time.
Yeah. Melanie, do you feel comfortable kind of walking us through some of the statistics on birthing in the US in a hospital? Within the community, we've got mamas that, we go from like mamas that are free birthing their 4th child to women that are really familiarizing themselves with different ways to birth and kind of like just beginning to think about that. One of the things I think is really interesting and definitely informed some of the decisions I made was less of this like woo-woo emotional bit. And it was number one, really tuning into where I felt most comfortable. And so for me in particular, I feel really scared and uncomfortable in a hospital. And then the other part that I looked at was just, I love data. There's a part of me that just loves the numbers and loves the data. Would you want to talk about any of that?
You mean like maternal mortality rates here in
Yeah.
this country?
Yeah, and just intervention rates and how those intervention rates have gone up historically and what we think that type of intervention leads to.
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the facts is that as a developing country, we have an alarming high number percentage of maternal mortality. for, for an industrialized nation. And it's rising, which just feels really incongruent for a country that pours so much money into healthcare. So there's a system that's pretty broken there. And it's important to highlight that it's heightened incredibly for Black women, Black mothers, and women of color in general. And there is an organization which I stand behind so fully and support, which is Every Mother Counts. Every Mother Counts, which is founded by Christy Turlington, does a lot of work to not only educate, but highlight the disparities in maternal health care and the lack of equality and relatability and respect and equitable maternal care that kind of plagues our nation. So I'll start with that, but that's a whole other topic, but an important one nonetheless.
Important one, and also, it feeds into the data. It's more data there where it's undeniable,
Yes, it is undeniable. And it continues to bleed into, mothers in general. So there is definitely, I would say I've been doing birth work for a little over 10 years. And I would say that I do see an increase in this, in the interventions and in the induction rates that are pushed on birthing people. And I lead courses every month with mothers that are showing up and saying, my doctor says that they want to induce me at 39 weeks. And, what can I do? And so the education piece is really key because, again, we only know what we know. We only know what we know, and we can only go with what we've been exposed to. So what I feel is inspiring is that now, especially in these last few years, we get to see a lot more births. Social media has its pros and cons in so many ways, but one of the pluses that I really appreciate is that we see a lot more births now. I know that, 19 years ago when I had my first child, I didn't see any of that, all over the place. And I was living here in the Pacific Palisades, and I remember my ex-husband and we thought for a second, we're like, we should do a home birth. And we owned a yoga studio in that area. And it was like people just fell on us like, no, like that's so dangerous. And And I was susceptible to the fear, and so I muted my inner voice that prompted me to that. I didn't really have relationships with midwives around me, even though I was in the yoga community, which I would think I'd have more, but I wasn't. And so I chose a hospital birth. I had a really super sweet OB, and I've worked with her as a doula, but definitely more conservative. And they were hospital births, vaginal births nonetheless, but there was a hospital gown on me. There were straps on my abdomen. I wasn't induced or anything, but there was that medicalization of something that to me felt really off. And so now we can flip on Instagram, and in a few minutes, we can see 50 different births with all different, expressions of motherhood and different women having babies in all different ways. And I think that's important because that's how we make brain models. My daughter, who's 19, has come to me with me to several home births. And if you have a conversation with her and you were to ask her, well, how do you want to birth? She's like, I'm going to have my baby at home. That's not something that I could say at that age. That's not something that I could say when I had my child yet, because I didn't have those brain models. And that's not saying that it's for everybody. But suddenly we've planted new seeds in our children and in ourselves. And we're starting to actually feel like, oh, I could do that. If she could do that, I could do that. And so I think that, yes, it's alarming, but I also feel like sometimes things have to get really loud and really scary before a creation operator comes in and brings some upgrade in consciousness. And so I am seeing it, and I am I am a massive activist for better education and more respect for mothers in all ways, and less fear mongering and less rhetoric. We have to start exposing that knowledge so that we as mothers can start asking the questions when we're pregnant.
Yeah. And obviously, tuning into where you are most comfortable and making informed decisions about that. And there are so many ways to birth and birth naturally and do it where you feel comfortable. But would I be correct in saying that statistically birthing at home in the US has a more positive, safer outcome for the mother and baby than birthing in the hospital?
I would like to say yes, but there's so many variants to that. Because, one of the midwives I work with the most, she will turn certain people down for home birth because you have to do the work, as you know, to have a healthy birth. The work comes beforehand. You don't just show up and have a safe birth at home. You want to be eating well. You want to be getting the right prenatal care. You want to, have worked through some of your fears before you get to that place. So, yes, I'd like to say that birthing at home is very safe. So, yes, that is a fact. But there's always variance to that. And I do believe that you can have safe hospital births, but it's the continual interventions at hospital that are problematic. So yes, statistically, we see a lot of problems, but it doesn't only come from the birth. It comes from lack of good prenatal care. It comes from lack of education. It comes from lack of being able, that person feeling like the person who's actually their provider. There's relatability, cultural relatability, community relatability. It you want to feel like the person who you're working with actually understands where you come from, and that's not the case very often. So I think at home birth you have someone who's approaching birth, number one, who's looking at birth in through a very different lens. We call it physiologic birth. OBs don't really get the opportunity in their course of study to mentor under midwives, which I would love to see. I would love for the schooling, for the training of OBs to be like, okay, part of your experience in getting your degree is you are going to mentor under this midwife and go to home births with them, so you can see what physiologic birth looks like. Physiologic birth meaning an undisturbed, mother-driven birth where we're not inducing, where we are actually allowing not even allowing, let me take that word out, supporting the mother in moving around, in nourishing herself while she's in labor, in drinking enough fluids, and being in a safe environment where she doesn't feel like she's watched too much or prodded or poked too much. If that's not something that doctors have seen and they've been trained in how to manage emergencies only, then when they show up and you show up, that's how they're going to look at you.
Well, hopefully. I mean, I feel like Cedars, just from in the last decade, I feel like that's a hospital that's actually maybe, and best because you are there, but it feels like maybe on the outside, they've taken some of the feedback from what people are looking for, and are they a little more lenient in letting people move around? Are they more doula friendly? Do they listen to people advocating for themselves more? I feel like
The nurses or the doctors?
The nurses?
So bless nurses. They are so hardworking, and I have had such great experiences working with nurses, and I've had some negative experiences working with nurses. Again, It comes down to training and schooling and scheduling, and are they getting the self-care that they need so they can show up the right way? All of that. So yeah, Cedars definitely they welcome doulas, and I know several of the nurses there, and they're most of the time so incredibly supportive. But it really depends so much on the OB. If there is an OB that is, they know who they're working under. They know the person that's going to come in and want you to be on your back, or they know that doctor that's going to come in, say, break the bed down, it's time to push, and they break the bed down, pull you down, pull up the stirrups and such. That happens at Cedars. I mean, I was just at Cedars with a very well-known OB, and she managed it that way. And you can't unsee what you see as a doula. And so, yes, I'd like to say that Cedars is open to doulas, and they get good training on how to try to accommodate that, and they get out of your way. Oftentimes when they see a doula in the room, a lot of the times if I'm there, and I'm there less and less, but if they see you, they're like, great, let me know if you need anything, and they get out of your way, which is like, thank you so much. We turn the lights down, we get some washcloths, we put on some music, and we make it like a really comfortable space. But it has a lot to do with the practitioner that you've chosen to work with. And so the work for the client or for the mother is to really, really be mindful of who she's choosing, who they are choosing to be their care provider. Because when you're in it, when you're deep in it and hormones are flowing and you're in that cave, yes, you advocate for yourself, but it's tricky. You're not in here. You're not in your neocortex. You're not meant to be there. So it's not a place where you're like multitasking, making decisions and all of that. You're kind of in your space. So the work that you do beforehand with your partner, if you have a partner, with your doula and with your team, is really important, because once you jump in the rabbit hole, it's a trickier to kind of say no at that moment. When your baby comes onto you, you're not really looking and saying, oh, by the way, don't clamp the cord. I mean, you're in it, you're in a flow of, and so things are done sometimes without you knowing, and you realize after the fact. So I don't know if I kind of went off on a tangent there, but
I think it's really, really important for people to hear, and it is making those sober and sound decisions early in the journey, because you're right. By the time you're in active labor and in the hours thereafter in birth, you're right, things are happening to you. Somebody could be cutting and sewing your vagina and doing things to your baby, and you literally do not even know that that's occurring.
Yeah, using a bulb syringe before your baby's really even fully been born, when only the head is out, and starting to use the bulb syringe, or wiping a face down. I mean, there's just, and I get it. You're stepping into a hospital is a place where people go when they're sick. So you're stepping into a place that is really, there's a lot of insurance policies there, and they're there to help you if there's a problem. And I'm so grateful that that's what they're there for. I mean, we're so lucky to have all the medicine that we have. I will not call any of these medications good or bad, because they're life-saving many times. And the work that doctors do is so profoundly important. But birth is not a medical experience unless it can become one, but it's not one to begin with for most cases. There are some legitimate high-risk situations. There are legitimate reasons for cesareans, few. There are legitimate reasons for Pitocin and for some of the medications, but they're oftentimes misused and abused.
So the only thing that, I kind of want to get into a couple of things, and then dive into all of our questions, but we really didn't get any questions around the placenta. And I'm just obsessed with the placenta. I love placentas. I have loved my own 2 placentas. If only I could have more placentas. But will you talk to us about the placenta as this intelligent organ?
Yes. I love talking about placentas. And, I never saw mine. I wasn't really shown after I pushed my babies out and delivered my placentas. They weren't really, no one said, meet your placenta. Your baby would not be alive without this beautiful communicator and intelligent, barrier and bridge, not barrier, actually, a bridge between the two of you. So your placenta is really your baby's placenta. It comes from the splitting of of all that's happening with your baby's growth and the fetal development, and becomes that powerhouse, that mothership that communicates between you and baby, that helps that communication path through the umbilical cord to your baby. And it does this beautiful like biomimicry. I guess that's the word that comes to mind, where it becomes part of your body. It's like it kind of does a Yoda trance on the body and makes itself part of the body, so the body will not attack it and reject it. Like if you have a transplant of sort or an implant put into your body, your intelligent immune system right away goes to attack it because it detects a foreigner inside. Not with the placenta. The placenta just kind of morphs itself into the uterine wall and is like, nobody sees me, I'm here, don't, let me make myself part of the whole. And it does that, and the body supports it. And so it continues to grow as the fetus grows, and it continues to communicate and to filter and to nourish and to protect baby as baby grows. It's almost like when you see like one of those beautiful spaceships out in space, and the space person is kind of flying. That's kind of like how I imagine the placenta. It's like the source of connection to mother. And when it's time to give birth, you birth your baby, and the placenta does not stop working at that point, which is something that's really important for us all to know. There is an intelligence between that organ and your baby. Once your baby comes into this realm, breathing and learning to take its first breath, the placenta amps up and is communicating and helping your baby as it's adapting to this new way of breathing and hearing and seeing. And if the way that we know this is if you touch that cord of communication between placenta and baby, it is communicating. It's kind of like if I feel my pulse right now, it's like every one of those, heartbeats is sending energy to my whole body. If you feel that cord, it is like, and that goes on sometimes for 10 minutes or more. And so we have to ask, if that cord is done and we're really going to clamp it and cut it right away, then why is it still communicating? What is it sending to baby? Well, it's sending about this much blood to your baby that belongs to your baby. So it's sending a good amount of blood to baby that belongs to baby, that has oxygen and stem cells and nutrients. It's sending its support because it has detected baby has left the ship and they need all of my support. And so as birth workers, we really encourage mothers to be and parents to be to explore that awareness and to make a decision that feels sound for them, to perhaps put on their birth wishes or request that cord not be clamped right away. Let's not even worry about it being cut. If it's clamped, it's done. So some people say, don't cut the cord. Don't clamp the cord. Don't clamp the cord until we have actually felt it. When you feel it, and it'll look like a beautiful purple telephone cord. And then minute by minute by minute by minute by minute, you see it kind of finishing its work. You see it from this full telephone cord. And again, you can see this on the UMA platform probably. And it goes from being this curly, big, thick umbilical cord to becoming like a white shoestring. It's done. When you feel it, it's lost its pulse and it's complete. And so that's part of my fascination with Mother Nature. After that, you have this baby and oxytocin is running through you, and oxytocin is making your uterus contract because it's time for the placenta to now be birthed as well. And the placenta hopefully detaches itself, and you birth your placenta. And when you birth your placenta, it is really nice to get to see this organ that is the only organ that we will ever create specifically. It's a disposable organ that we will create specifically to support the life that is growing within. It's kind of like the earth underneath the tree. And it looks like that when you look at the placenta, the side that faces your baby, it looks like a tree of life. It's shiny and you can see all the roots that lead to the trunk, which is the cord that grew the baby. And when you look at what was inside the bag, and you can see the part of the placenta that was actually, what's outside of the bag. Inside the bag is the shiny portion of the placenta that your baby was facing. And when you look outside of the bag, the part of your placenta that was attached to your uterus looks kind of like a brain or like organ meat. And you can see all the valleys of it. And that's the part that grew along with your uterus and became part of your uterus for those 10 months or so. So it's nice to have a tour of that organ and to get to see where your baby grew. Yeah. And we could do a whole podcast on this.
The placenta. I actually want to throw all the questions out and let's just keep going here.
So some people consume their placenta and some people don't, and that's a very personal choice. It is. It's some people, the way that I have personally experimented with the placentas, I didn't know this when I had my babies. So with clients that didn't encapsulate their placentas with their first, and I've had them on their second babies and they've done it with their second, I've had a handful of moms that have done this. So it's kind of a good test. They come to me and they tell me that they felt more energy, that they felt that they had more milk production, and that they felt that they're healing, that it gave them a boost. And so they had a positive experience with it. But I also want to say that some people get their placenta encapsulated and they take it and then maybe they don't feel so good. So they modify that. You really kind of have to just see how you feel. At home births, many times clients will ask me to make them a placenta smoothie, which I know was one of the questions I saw that you asked. And to make a placenta smoothie, what you do is you cut off a small piece of the placenta, probably like at about that. We cut off a few pieces and I put it in the blender with a choice of fruit, whether it's blueberries or raspberries, maybe a half a banana, maybe some nut butter if they like, any kind of milk whatever milk that they drink. And I bring them this delicious smoothie with a straw and they drink it in a matter of seconds.
Yes, Greg, my husband, was my doula, which I just I don't know. I don't know if I would recommend that to anyone. He really was like, no, I'm here. I want to do this. I didn't ask him to do it. I also probably wouldn't ask a partner to be a doula, but when it was months before the birth and I discovered pads soaked in witch hazel in the freezer and I was not even halfway there, I was like, okay, the guy really wants the job. I think he's gonna do it. But he took that, he loved it. And I mean, if you have a home birth and your partner's really into it, he loved taking the placenta. he loved like getting it out in the kitchen and taking the knives. And, you know, he had like this whole method where he broke down. And I think Davy, my midwife, was like, why don't you try to do 3 days of smoothies? She felt like that was something that her clients really benefited from energetically. And so he like had it all pieced out. I saw it in the fridge and it was like, whoa, a little bit much for me, day 2. So it was a fun partner project.
That's amazing. That's amazing that he did that. I wonder if that's, I always think, I wonder if he had, was raised by really a great mother.
He was. He
Yeah.
also
Yeah.
really took care of like my poop in the floating in the tub in the living room, and like broke down that bloody poopy
Yeah.
bathroom and loved it. And so
I mean, that's great to hear. I'll have to interview him because I think that, one of my things that I love the most is working with the partners in, I mean, just so much love for all the people that I get to work with, and to see partners, and especially male partners. I think female partners are so fun to work with also, but to see male partners in a birth and sometimes in a room full of women. There's a midwife assistant, there's a doula, there's a mom just being completely in her primal transformed element, and to see a man just look and feel so helpless, like it's not my job to fix this, it's my job to hold space, to be a mountain. There's such a beautiful place, because oftentimes it's like, and if they happen to like turn their phone on, like the mom might be over there in the corner and just like turn her head around and say, put your phone down. It's like we have this bionic sense of self. So we always talk about these things before. What are going to be your triggers, so that she can communicate and say, hey, you know what, it's really going to trigger me to see you on your phone, or it's really going to trigger me if you start, playing with the dog, or, and so to see the evolution of partners through birth is just so powerful. That's a lot of the times their formal education on birth. So
yeah. And I think some men, they're not going to birth in this lifetime, but like, whoa, you see their comfort with it and their collaboration with it the whole way through. And it's not,
yeah.
and I say it only because we don't hear about that enough.
Yeah. Well, I think it comes from the lack of education, and before it was like, what was it like? Men were having their cigars outside and they weren't even invited into the room, and a mother was covered up to here. And if we look at the imprint that Hollywood has left on us, maybe now some different shows are coming and showing birth in a different way, like Handmaid's Tale or something. But when you see some of a lot of movies, you see a lot of yelling and a lot of scandal and a lot of don't look at me and don't touch me, and blankets all over and someone looking over a blanket. And so this is kind of how we've seen birth for a lot of us. So, and a lot of how men and boys have seen birth. So they don't have the brain models either. It's a lot of the times they're like, wow, I didn't even know that, I didn't even know you could do that. I didn't even know that that could happen. And sometimes, and I'll say sometimes, like to the partner, they don't have to be catching the baby, but I'll often say, do you want to help catch your baby? Or do you rather stand up by her side? That's okay. You don't have to be the one that's got blood on your hands and everything. But sometimes there's that curiosity and that invitation. And they're like, yeah, I'd love to help catch baby and hand baby to mom, or no, I just want to be here holding her hand. That's okay too.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's the invitation.
It just, for your child. I've got a 3.5-year-old that loves like anyone that she meets. She loves telling them that she popped out and she came out like this and her dad caught her. And like, that's part of her, that's her folklore. These are the stories that she loves to share, and how she thinks about herself and her dad. And it's cool. Okay, so I'm going to hop into community questions because we have oh so many, and we've covered some of them. But here's a specific one about preeclampsia and how to prevent it. And it sounds like, in particular, this person experienced it with baby number one and is looking to prevent for baby number two.
Mm. So preeclampsia, I mean, I think that I don't want to just say it's going to come down to working with stress levels, because it is very legitimate and it can just have to do with your body and the way that the birth hormones affect your body. But I would definitely say that support systems to any kind of blood pressure condition are going to be managing stress well and eating nutrient dense whole foods as much as possible. We know that there are conditions that we may not experience when we're not pregnant, and then we get pregnant, and the cocktail of hormones and what happens in pregnancy brings that condition up. So sometimes it's not like blaming ourselves for gestational diabetes or blaming ourselves for preeclampsia. Sometimes it just happens to be that combo of events in the gestation process. But for me, again, because I'm not a midwife, I would say speak to a midwife. And I'm happy to refer her to a great midwife who works with a lot of nutrition and could support that. I would say speak to a midwife. But from my doula perspective, I would say stress management, a meditation practice, yoga practice, making your stress management a priority in your life so that you create a hospitable environment with less stress in the body, and being really vigilant about your nutrition.
How about ideal timing in between pregnancies? And then I'll pose it another way, because there was a few people ask, what's the shortest amount of time we should have between pregnancies? Or what is the shortest amount of time we could have between pregnancies while not completely depleting ourselves?
It really does take about 18 months to start to feel. I mean, I think I can't say that because I was pregnant by 9 months. So I got pregnant with my second when I was, and this is important to know, breastfeeding full time, and I hadn't bled, and I got pregnant. And it was like, I'm pregnant. And so I was 9 months in, and so I went right in, so my children are 18 months apart. And for some people's bodies, it's okay. I think I definitely felt the depletion. And I actually went from being a vegetarian in my first pregnancy to being a meat eater in my second pregnancy, because I felt that I needed the iron and the support. But what we do know is that it takes a lot out of you. Not only being pregnant, but breastfeeding for a long time takes a lot out of you. So I guess it would be smart to give yourself a space of at least 18 months post, the 18 months after delivering, to let your body reboot. And I think sometimes, like some of the midwives I've worked with would say, a good 2 years to let your body reboot itself. And sometimes we need a little bit more.
Yeah, and I'll throw it out there, and I always say it because there's such a rush in this culture to, like, 6 weeks, you're back to work, you're back in your jeans, it's like this like back pressure. So I'll just say that I don't feel, and I don't even know what back is, I don't feel grounded in my body, and I don't feel like my brain is functioning in a way that feels my own for 3 years. It really takes, like, after that 3-year mark, and I've had the spaciousness to kind of like go through those postpartums and feel them. I also nurse for 3 years, so it could have to do with that. but
Yeah, that definitely will influence it. And I think that, yeah, the 2 to 3 year mark is where you really feel that reboot. But it doesn't happen before 18 months for sure. I think that that's kind of what I'm more focused on, is knowing that, if you get pregnant accidentally, or if it happens, it happens. But ideally, you need to know that it really does take up to 18 months to start feeling yourself. And then at that point, to start replenishing all the systems that were drained, like you said, your adrenals, your, everything. I mean, there's a reason why our libidos shut down. It's like self-preservation. And to address the word you said, I'm really glad you brought that up, because that is such a pet peeve. I don't have many pet peeves, but the whole talk of when will I get back? That's kind of not a very
maybe you're never going
evolutionary.
back.
It's not, I mean, it's not an evolutionary reality. We don't move backwards. We don't regress. Babies do not regress. 4-month regression, I would love to rename that as a 4-month reorganizing. We don't go back. Me going back is, we're always evolving. That's all that nature knows how to do, is evolve. It feels at times like there's a setback, but it's oftentimes that arrow pulling back, because it's going to launch forward and there's going to be this expansion. And so, as mothers, again, we've learned, we hear it through society, get your body back, do this, get back, fit back in that. We've had an upgrade, and this upgrade is going to mean a new sense of self in every way. So if we stop obsessing about going back and we open our curiosity to what's actually ahead, who have I become now that I've birthed a human and fed a human and grown a human, and my whole psyche has changed after that. Your friends change, what you like has changed, your foot might grow, I mean, there's so many things that change, that when we're stuck on going back in anything of our life, even with relationships, when we're stuck on trying to get back to something that was, instead of looking of what is coming, we're just not going to enjoy the process.
And I'll underscore the relationship thing, that is definitely an evolution, and there's no going back. And you will make yourself miserable wondering about when you're going back. Conceiving with endometriosis. Have any experience there?
Yes, I do. I've had clients who were not able to conceive and could not figure out why. And it was indeed endometriosis getting in the way. And I guess all I can say to that was, now we hear a lot more about endometriosis, which, is hard to figure out if, that it's there for a lot of people. And so what helped several of my clients was being acupuncture, working with functional medicine doctors and practitioners. And some people did end up getting pregnant without, a medical intervention, and some did IVF to get pregnant. And that was the way that they were able to hold a pregnancy and actually get pregnant.
Okay.
But I want to acknowledge that, because it's challenging and it's a struggle. And there are, aside from endometriosis, there are a lot of, there's a lot more awareness about infertility. And so, again, in my scope of practice, because I don't want to overstep my boundaries, I'm not a midwife or an OB. From my perspective as a teacher and a doula, I believe that managing your stress can go a long way. Managing your stress, and we know that stress causes inflammation. We can only push this body so much without it screaming. And so we have to address those foundations as well.
We had a lot of mamas and mamas to be writing in about conception at 43, conception at 45, and just wanting to get your thoughts there, your experience with seeing women in mid 40s conceiving for the first time, the second time, the third time, and you have any thoughts there.
And I think it makes a difference. So yes, I have had clients that have conceived naturally at that age. I had a client who I've had clients I had a client who was not even trying, and she thought, oh, I'm not going to get pregnant. And then she happened to get pregnant. And kind of talking back about spirit babies, there is, an order in everything when we least expect it. So yes, I do believe that a lot of it has to do, look, we can't put a number on someone and say that you're geriatric because you happen to just turn 35 or 37, or you are in your early 40s. And so you're geriatric. And so you're put under this like horrible name, which I don't even like to say. So we can't put everyone, it has a lot to do with your genes and with how you care for yourself and how you treat your body and how you eat and how you live. Yes, does it get harder for us to get pregnant as we get older? Yes, that is a fact that it gets more challenging. So I've had clients that have gotten pregnant naturally, and I've had clients that have also done IVF to get pregnant, because I would say that we are seeing a lot more mothers that are, close to their 40s and in their late 30s getting pregnant and having babies. So it varies.
And do you see that the postpartum period is generally a little more profound, and people are maybe needing more support and care in repleting themselves after pregnancy later?
When they're in their 40s, you mean?
Yeah,
Or
I'm
just
just
in general?
I had my babies were almost a decade apart, and so having
Mm-hmm.
a baby in my 20s was one experience, and you kind of own like, ooh, the energy sort of bounces back, and like it seemed fine to stay up all night every night for years. And then having that experience in my late 30s, I was like, oh, it's doable. I'm still having the experience. It was just I felt like I needed more support.
Yeah, I think that as you get older, and I mean, in general, we need a little extra support. These bodies are, they're aging, and we do need that support. But it's very individual, it's very individual in my experience. I had a client who had her baby in her early 40s, and she was a like one of these, I don't know what you call it, marathon or triathlons or Ironman or one of these like really torturous things that people voluntarily sign up for, which is so not for me. But she was like amazing she was a very amazing athlete, and her recovery was incredible. It was incredible. She also, she has a bone broth company. And so she ate really well throughout her pregnancy, and she ate really well in postpartum. And she really took good care of herself throughout both. So, I think, yes, to say that as we get older, we do need to care for our bodies with a little more diligence, and we don't bounce back as easily. That's a fact. But you'd be surprised of how many younger women sometimes I see really go through the ringer in postpartum, either because they didn't anticipate how challenging it could be, or because they wanted to jump back too quickly. And so they started doing a lot too quickly, or because they didn't really plan for the support needed. So I think that our power lies in really education. Again, the fourth trimester is a real thing. Um, in my culture, it's called the cuarentena, the first 40 days. In the Chinese culture, it's called the sitting month. There's a reason that indigenous cultures really had reverence for the postpartum chapter. It's because we are completely uprooted, and we have very shallow roots in postpartum, no matter what age you're at. you may find that, sometimes I think that as we get older, we have a little more wisdom and we're more mindful about that care. So we might have a more positive experience than when you have lots of energy and you're like, I'm going to get up and go. And then you're like, oh, that was a giant clot that just came out of me. Or suddenly I'm starting to feel scattered and weepy. And it's the body starts to scream and say, let me hibernate, let me rest. And it's not something that's really highly promoted in our society.
No, it's even something that people that do attempt to do that for themselves, you're met with ridicule
Yeah.
in some cases, just like the shaming and the ridiculing, and there's still part of our culture that, and sadly a lot of it seems to actually come from women, not men.
Mm-hmm.
But this, like, I had my baby and I was on the phone back to work in the hospital. Like I was getting cocktails 4 nights later, like get out there, and kind of this shaming around folks that feel like, no, I feel like I want like stay really warm and have socks and have hot foods. And so to each her own. But I do.
Yeah, I mean, but it's a reflection again of the masculinization. I don't even know if that's a word of this experience. And I'm not talking male, female. This is not gender. It's the masculine versus feminine energy.
Yeah.
Like my friend who's a birth worker, Britta, she talks about Artemis and Apollo, the Artemisian experience of birth, which is that more abstract space where things are not linear and based on formula and bright and watched. Birth and postpartum belong more in the darkness, not in the darkness meaning you're not going to go out and get sun, but postpartum is a time of deep hibernation, of integration. You've just grown a human for 10 months and birthed a human, no matter how you gave birth to that human. We have to get more sophisticated, whether you birth through cesarean or you home birth or there's going to be factors for each of them that make the experience less challenging or more challenging. But beyond all of that, it's a state of hibernation. It's a state where usually there would be a village of women there tending to you, wrapping you, bringing you warm foods, massaging you, so that you could bond and connect with this human that you still feel as part of you. That baby and you are still like, wait, are you me? Am I you? But suddenly you're out here. There's a part of my heart that's out here. I have some of your cells. You have some of myself. All of that's going on, that's telling the brain support, 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 produce, produce. When that's severed because either we don't have the support or baby's over in another room in a million pajamas and stuff, and your body's not creating that communication, then it's going to reflect that. And so postpartum is a big conversation that I have with clients and with students. I'm like, let's talk about the best way that people can support you. Tell them not to send you a million onesies and fancy cribs and all that. Tell them to put a fund toward massages, a housekeeper, a dog walker, someone to bring you organic, fresh, homemade foods. That's what we want to invest in.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's like another full podcast.
I know. I told you, Amanda, you
40 days.
can't start me because I just keep going.
No, I know. And I'm right there with you. I want to go there. Okay. Breastfeeding while pregnant.
Mm.
Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to it from a personal experience because I was, like I said, I was pregnant with my son when my daughter was 9 months, and I was still nursing her until she was about 13 months. So there was a portion of my pregnancy that I was feeding her, and it was fine for me. In the beginning, there was tenderness in my breast because of all the hormones from pregnancy, but remarkably that passed pretty soon, and I didn't have an aversion to feeding her with that sensation. Some people do, and that you need to honor that. And I think I also started pumping more at that point. So she was breastfeeding less, but then around 13 months, she just was done. She didn't really want the breast anymore. And she was eating and moving and doing. And at that point, she kind of weaned herself. But I know that for some people, it becomes a lot in the beginning, especially. It becomes a lot to have a baby on you. So you have to do what feels right for you. Sometimes pumping helps so that you can pump and then not have to be nursing. But I actually really enjoyed having that experience while I was pregnant with her. What I did learn recently, I think it was on a podcast, that if you are breastfeeding and then, if you weren't breastfeeding and you give birth, you produce colostrum because that's the first nectar for baby. That's what they need. And the curiosity was, well, what happens if I'm breastfeeding the whole time and then I have a baby? Do I produce colostrum or am I producing more mature milk? And the answer from the midwife was that you switch to producing colostrum for the newborn, that the body tends to the newborn. And so you produce colostrum, and sometimes that colostrum is not appetizing to the older baby or not. But yeah, so I thought that was a pretty cool thing to learn. I didn't really know that until I heard it.
That is cool. I've also heard about the milk flavor changing during the different phases of your cycle. And I would notice that in certain phases, my daughter it would not be her favorite, and this is as she was a toddler. And in other phases, there'd just be a lot more nursing, and the flavor changes, which is interesting.
That is interesting. And that sounds very, very logical. I don't know personally because I never got my period before getting pregnant again. So, but what we should mention that is really incredible, another one of the miracles, is that every time your baby puts their mouth on your nipple, the saliva cues the body for what it needs to produce according to what the receptors in the saliva have. So when your baby is sick and your baby nurses, the body sends antibodies. When your baby nurses, the body essentially makes the milkshake that the baby needs at that time and produces it. So that symbiotic relationship of Mother Nature with mother and baby is undeniable. It's undeniable.
Yeah, and there's so much more research coming out about, things I think there's so much we still don't know about. I mean, we know we're doing it, we're experiencing it, but the scientists to put it in print for us to read and know with our minds about breast milk, just some of the cancer research that's happening. And yeah, if you want to go have a fun afternoon and just start reading about breast milk. I mean, that is a whole other podcast we could have. And maybe we will have that one. We will have
that's for sure. But I mean, who sparks the to your point, we are the ones that have to spark those discoveries. The more that we're tuning in, which kind of comes back to the very beginning of our conversation, the more that we're actually owning our experience and staying curious about what our bodies are doing and really being present with it, that's when we start to realize, oh, wait, that just happened, or oh, wait, that felt this way. That's where these revelations start coming through. If we're disconnected and we're just kind of saying, you tell me everything I need to do and you're the boss outside of me, then I'm not going to have those revelations. It's like postpartum. We want to press fast forward on postpartum. Because I know it's hard. It's hard. Postpartum can be really gritty and full of highs and full of really dark lows. And we learn to hold those contrasting energies in postpartum. But we have to stay curious. So instead of pressing that fast forward button, it's like, just hold off and really be present, because every single one of those experiences is ripening you for the next stage of motherhood. It's really ripening you. That's where the boot camp is. It's in that. And it's not a boot camp of like, sit there and suffer alone. Let's make sure we're not mistaking it for that. It's a boot camp of coming back to the present moment, letting yourself be in the present moment with it all, with the sorrow, with the sadness, with the grief, with the joy, with the highs, with the falling in love. There's that bittersweet. I mean, I'm sure you remember seeing your son and your daughter and being like the highest high and the lowest low all in one. And it
Yeah.
has nothing to do with you not loving your baby. It has everything to do with you saying, oh my God, you're no longer mine inside of me. I'm letting you go. As soon as born, I'm learning to let go. As soon as our children are born, we are learning to let go. And postpartum is a big place of letting go.
Yeah. And expanding so that you can hold both of those experiences in yourself and hold yourself in that, because before you know it, you will have a toddler that is really acting in that way. And I think it does when you can stretch and hold around yourself and have that confidence for yourself. The more you can stretch and do that, the more you can show up for a 3-year-old is like, I got you. You're crying,
Confidence,
baby.
compassion, all of those things.
All of that is like, it's not foreign to you. It's not scary. It's like, yes, that's what we do. And let me love you through this. So
Yeah. Yeah. Big feelings are really scary to a lot of people. And in postpartum, we are having the big feeling. Like
mhm.
sometimes moms will say, I don't know why I'm crying. I just sat here and cried. I don't know what's wrong with me. I'm sorry. And I'm like, never say I'm sorry for your feelings. And number two, something good is happening. Something good is happening. Whenever we're feeling, something good is happening. Whenever we're feeling, something good is happening. And we need to know that, especially as parents, because we are going to be the guardians and the teachers for these young children. And so we want them to be able to have their full spectrum of feelings.
Yeah.
We want to be able to hold it and address it in a conscious way. So yeah, that's postpartum.
Yeah. So the net and we're gonna have to like whittle it down the last few here. And this is Sophie's choice, but you may not want to touch this one. And this may be something that I do need to bring to a midwife, or you may just want to comment on it anecdotally. And this is forever a question in our community, is around herbs and adaptogens during pregnancy. And my response to this is always, I am not a doctor. I am not a midwife. I am not an herbalist. Um, Adaptogens are contraindicated by the FDA for pregnancy, though there has never been a human study done because that's considered unethical. There have been rat studies that have been done on ashwagandha in particular. And through these rat studies, they saw that, miscarriage could be implicated. We do have thousands of years of human use to reference. And so, again, not doctor, not midwife, but what I did was I did check in with my midwives at the time. And for me, I experienced depression in my first trimester, depression and anxiety with each pregnancy. And so for me, taking adaptogens was actually the thing that really, really helped me to get through those first 3 months. So I'm not sure if you want to touch it or if you just.
I'm glad you're touching on it from your personal experience and from being the mama of Moon Juice, and you work so carefully and responsibly with all of your creations. So I think it's important for people to hear that from you as someone who went through it without you being the midwife or the doctor. What I can say is that I will personally say I don't necessarily always trust the FDA. So that's up to you, but I know that that's another podcast. But I will say that I have had the honor of working with midwives who use herbs, and who use herbs really safely with your consent as a client, with your own research as a client. And, I think that sometimes it's ironic that, some medications will be prescribed, whether it's to induce or whether it's to support postpartum, that are really hefty pharmaceuticals. And yet something that is alternative, that has not been approved by the FDA, which could really support a mother's well-being, is a kind of like, poo-pooed, or said to be not to use it. So a lot of mothers do start taking things into their own hands and doing their own exploration. So you're right, I can address it from a medical practitioner point of view. But what I would say to listeners is, again, the more in tune you are with, the more you'll know what to take and not, but always bring it to your midwife. And if you are working with a medical practitioner that's an OB and you're curious about alternative forms of support, reach out to a midwife. And if you don't have a skilled midwife that works with herbs, or alternative medicines, let me know, and I'm happy to connect you with a midwife that would. So that way, what you have is you do your own research. That's kind of where I'm going to leave it. Be willing to do your own research in every aspect.
Yeah. And I think a really important tip that you gave that I'll just reiterate is your doctor and your OB most likely has not been trained. And so their automatic answer be no, and you really do need to reach out to somebody that's been trained, like a midwife.
Yeah.
Okay. So do you have time for two more?
Yes.
Okay. We'll do two more. And
I booked myself all the way out till 3 p.m. I'm just kidding.
Okay. Thank you, Patti. So I got a number of these questions and I was like, oh my God, okay, Patti can really speak to this. A number of women said that they felt really afraid they were too small to birth naturally. And so I feel like too small as a person, into my hips are too small, to I'm small and my baby's getting really big. So can you put us at ease with natural birthing, no matter
Okay, so let's take the first one. I guess first and foremost, I will say I look bigger on the screen, but I'm only 5'1", and I birthed 2 babies vaginally, not huge babies, but I birthed 2 babies vaginally without any problem. So as far as your height being petite, we have to know that women have been birthing, and really until, I know when it was cesareans really started getting like in the loop in the 80s, I would say. So before then, women were all birthing vaginally. So petite women like me were part of that demographic. So I do not believe that your height and petite body make a difference in how you birth. Pelvic measurements. There is an incredibly small percentage. Again, I'm going to preface this by saying I'm not a midwife and I'm not an OB, but I'm someone who's been in the birth world I've been in the birth world for almost 2 decades. I've been a doula for a little over 10 years, and I have not seen a pelvis that has a size, an internal size issue birthing a baby. There's a very, very small percentage where that happens. And truthfully, the issue is if you feel that for some reason you are petite and you are indeed carrying a larger baby, remember there is so much room for error when they measure your baby. The only way to measure a baby is when that baby's born. So you can have an interpretation of how big that baby is, and preferably the way that they're measuring your baby is by feeling your baby, not with an ultrasound, because there's a lot of room for error there. But if you are indeed carrying a bigger baby and you feel that you're carrying a bigger baby and you are concerned about that, my suggestion is stay mobile. Stay mobile in labor. Mobility is going to help that baby descend. Mobility is going to help that baby position itself, and mobility is going to help you find the right position to birth your baby. So from my opinion as a birth worker and as a doula, I do not believe that the size of your body and the size of your pelvis, because no one's coming in there and taking measurements of your pelvis from the inside, that it does not oftentimes get in the way. How's that answer for you?
I love that answer. Okay, so there are four things that we have to get to before I can let you go.
Fire away.
Okay, so tearing, we had a lot of questions around tearing, and I feel like tearing is a big fear. And so the questions around tearing, a lot of them were actually around, is tearing more common at home or in the hospital? Yeah, a bunch of people sort of wondering, is there a difference there? Is there one place that will lead to tear more?
So tearing happens sometimes. It happens in like the most optimal birth, a little tearing can happen. And it's not always the end of the world. A small tear can happen and it can actually heal itself beautifully without stitches. This is something that a lot of people don't know. It's something I didn't know until I worked with midwives, that sometimes a stitch and a small tear can lead to more problems in healing than letting the tissues heal on their own. So that's good to know. Tearing happens sometimes. And I guess there is the discussion of like, do certain positions increase the tearing? I can say that in personal experience, unfortunately, when you cannot feel when you're pushing, when you are very numb and you cannot feel and you don't have the guidance of sensation when pushing, you can push right through some of that sensation. And the sensation is therefore not guiding you. There's a reason that that sensation is there. It's to kind of help guide us. And so that can definitely be one of the things that can increase tearing, like excessive tearing, is not being able to feel. The second thing is a practitioner. If you are numb and you've had an epidural and that practitioner, because you're numb, that practitioner is more aggressive on your tissues, that can create tearing as well, which looks kind of like that. So no orchestra fingers unless it is completely necessary. To pushing down tissues can sometimes lead to that tearing. Also, things that can help you not tear in the moment of pushing are warm compresses. You know, heat helps to make tissues a little more resilient and elastic. So asking that your practitioner or whoever's helping you, whether it's a midwife, a doula, a nurse, whoever's there, put the warm compress on the perineum so that the tissues relax a little bit. Taking your time and not rushing through pushing can help. The way that you eat during your pregnancy can make a huge difference. You want to make sure that you're eating fats. You want to make sure that you're eating nutrient-dense foods, foods that are going to help the elasticity of your skin and your tissues. And also, we have to keep in mind that when there's fear, everything does this and tightens. Like if you kind of think about having an orgasm, and I mean, I'll even kind of backtrack. I talk about this in birth prep and in the class in Bloom. When we're 12 or 13, before we've ever put a tampon in, it seems like, oh my God, how am I ever going to put that little like small size tampon in? It just will never fit. It'll hurt. And then eventually we learn to put the tampon in. And then cut to, if we're going to have intercourse, and there's going to, we're going to actually have intercourse. We think, how is that ever going to work? But as we relax and as we feel loved and as we feel safe and as we start to get juicier and oxytocin is being poured through our system, those tissues, of the vagina, they just really start to welcome the lovemaking, and they expand and they engulf. But it has to do with oxytocin. So the same thing happens in birth. We want that cascade of oxytocin to help our tissues become more elastic and receptive and spacious. So I would say, not being in a fear-based environment is also going to help. Positioning can definitely help. Sometimes people say that being in warm water helps the tissues become more elastic, but I've also seen some tearing in water births. Sometimes people use the birthing stool. I have heard that being in stirrups can create more tearing. I have seen sometimes that that's the case, but there was also an epidural involved in there. So I guess to kind of answer this is a whole topic of conversation. Number one, we have to understand that tearing can happen, and tearing versus an episiotomy, which is a cut, tearing is fibrous. And so the healing can be better than when there's a cut, and that cut can sometimes pull a little bit lower. So the tear can heal beautifully if we take care of ourselves in postpartum, if we stay in bed a lot, if we eat well, if we take care of ourselves. You can have a beautiful recovery. Same with cesarean, you can have a really beautiful recovery from abdominal surgery if you really are strict about caring for yourself. So I hope that helps with tearing.
I'll add a little, just an anecdotal, my own personal thing, because I found it to be really incredible. So with both of my births, there was very minimal tearing. I didn't feel when it was happening, and it's not something that I even felt afterwards. And there was no stitching, no issues there. With my second birth, it was happening so fast. It was like the train was running through me. There was no pushing. She came out in 2 contractions. And so I didn't have the experience of pushing. I had the experience of like hanging on to the edge of a tub for dear life and letting the train run through. And at one point, her head was moving so fast, and my body naturally started to do this panting, and it just kicked into its own gear, which in hindsight, I realized, like, it was this chapter in this Ina May Gaskin book that I read like 10 years ago, that a woman can stop, or a midwife can stop and help a woman to do this like wild panting. And by no means did that move come from me reading a book a decade ago and remembering in the moment. It was not that. It was just really being in an environment where I felt safe, being in an environment where I felt like I was in control of my own process, and my body having that confidence that, there's an intelligence there that just kicks in. And, if you can set it up so that you really get to live your process, there's so much naturally happens.
It's great that you bring that up, because what's happening is, so what you're referring to is that place where you are crowning, and instead of pushing through it, you let the tissues stretch. And that's really the ring of fire. That ring of fire, when it shows up, it's there as a protective mechanism. It's there to kind of shoot endorphins down into the area to help numb and to help relax those muscles. So the either the panting, like you said, or even just blowing, and having that practitioner be patient enough to stop you, which, I've seen people like Dr. Crane and, amazing midwives be like, okay, now slow down there, slow down, instead of like this, like, yeah, go, go. It's like, slow down and let your tissues stretch. And in that moment, you're breathing and you're blowing through and you're blowing through. And the tissues are being held by your baby's head, and they're slowly adapting. And they're adapting. So we're not rushing or blowing through that. That also is incredibly helpful. So slowing down is really key. And one more thing I want to add to that is taking your own hand and placing it on your tissues. I had a client just recently who had a home birth after her first hospital birth, and she tore a lot in her first birth at the hospital because she was very numb, and she pushed right through, like she couldn't stop, and she pushed right through. And so there was a little bit of apprehension in this next one. And one of the things that we did and the midwife did was she actually did it. She reached down and she just held her tissues, and she held her clitoris area, and she held her tissues, and she kind of was like, and she started to kind of pant her baby's head down into her hand. And so it's like, I mean, there's just my mind is blown every single birth that I do of the intuitive nature that we have if we're given the space and the safety and the, like when a midwife says, I want you to know that I trust birth. That's like, what, suddenly that means like, oh shoot, that means I need to trust it. So just that conversation of someone telling you, I trust birth, I trust that your body knows how to do this, that puts you at the top of the pyramid. And that means you are the one that has to do the connecting. We're here to support you, but you are the one. You are the one leading the carriage. I'm trying to get away from the sun because it's
going back to, you know, what you first shared with us is really, it's about choosing your team. And so that may even be a good question to go in with for a doctor, for a midwife, is how is that ring of fire moment handled? And, you know, just getting their answer there would probably be insightful.
Yeah, and saying, you know, I want some warm water. I want a warm compress. I want to be able to breathe through it. I want to be rushed. There's this thing sometimes, not all the time, but oftentimes at hospitals where it becomes like a coaching, like you're at a sports event, and the nurses start to do this like go go go, and I'm like, I get it, we get excited, and sometimes you're in it so deep and you need that person to be like, to pull you out. But there's a really intuitive way to do it instead of making it like, harder, harder, faster, faster. It's like, no, not necessarily.
So we have a lot of questions also around epidurals. And so how the questions were posed is, how bad is an epidural? And so I'm assuming that the question is around, how does it affect me and how does it affect a baby? And maybe you could speak to that, and then maybe speak to the reasons why some people feel compelled to not have one.
So I'm gonna, might be controversial here, but I'm gonna really inspire you, the person asking the question, to let's try to put the words good and bad aside. Again, those to me are not the most sophisticated ways to look at anything in life. But let's actually think the pros or cons of it. Sometimes an epidural is what will get you to a vaginal birth. And I am the biggest proponent of home birth, but it's not for everybody. And an epidural may be what gets you to the other side for vaginal birth. So I like to call it less a good or bad. And I like to say, yes, we have to know the pros and cons of an epidural. Can an epidural derail the whole, trajectory? 100% it can. It can slow everything down to a point where labor stops. And if you are in a hospital, because if you're getting an epidural, you're in a hospital, then they'll have to give you the cocktail that brings everything into motion, which is Pitocin. And so that's where we start getting into this kind of, cocktail of pharmaceuticals that sometimes baby just doesn't like. And their heart tones change, and that can sometimes lead to a surgery, a cesarean. But the flip side of that is I have seen epidurals. I've sometimes been in home births that stall and that go on for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. And mom is just to a point, and we've done repositioning, and we've done Rebozo, and we've done IV fluids, and we've done everything we can. And that, you know, she's hitting a wall, and I want her to know that she can opt to transport to the hospital and have an epidural and get some rest. And I've seen her rest and then deliver her baby vaginally. So to me, it's less about like calling it good or bad. And to me, it's know that these are the pros. It can derail your birth. And number two, I really like to inspire people to say, to let them know, I know you can do this. And so if you're going to try it at home, just don't think like, well, I can always go to the hospital if I need it. Like, you have to be fully committed if you're going to be at home with it. Yes, it's an option if you go to the hospital. But I also don't want to feel like, I've seen it where women decide to get the epidural and they're like, then they cry and they're like, I know I failed. And I'm like, you did not fail. There is not a failure, because you know, if you did what you needed to do and this was the wise decision. We have to stop with the, you know, shaming or like, I failed because you didn't fail. So, you know, I guess where it comes in, the risks of an epidural is, can an epidural slow things down? Yes. Can an epidural sometimes lead to a cesarean? Yes. Anytime you introduce an intervention, you start walking closer to a cesarean. Can an epidural numb you out so much that you don't feel when you're pushing and you end up pushing for 3 hours? Yes, that is true. Can an epidural work and then they can turn it off and then you'll feel when you push? Yes, it can. Walking epidurals, there is in Cedars, you can get a walking epidural here where the cocktail that they give you with is a little different so that you can actually stand up and use gravity in your favor. Not every hospital has that, unfortunately. So I'm not on the team that's going to say, you know, I've seen many babies come out okay. Can it get in the way of breastfeeding? I guess it could. I haven't personally seen that the epidural does. What I've seen is that all of the layers of medication sometimes do start to get in the way of breastfeeding. I've seen after cesarean, the cocktail of medication that's given sometimes gets in the way of milk production. They're medications, the body's adapting and it's trying to, you know, it's trying to process everything it went through. So, you know, that's how I feel about epidurals. I do also want to say that you can get an epidural and you can still birth on your hands and knees if your legs have sensation. But if you don't want to get an epidural, my advice, and you are going to have a hospital birth, it's challenging. It's challenging to show up at the hospital and not have an epidural, because you know it's there. It's like, you know, if you're walking through the desert and you know, and you're at home and you know that there's not an epidural, then you're going to use the shower and you're going to use all these other techniques. But if you're in a hospital and they're saying epidural, 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 and you're like walking through the desert just dying for a glass of water, you're going to be like, yes, please. So, you know, again, like I have really in-depth conversations with people about it, and I don't want anyone to ever feel like they failed because they had to have an epidural or they chose to have an epidural in their birth. I'd love to teach them that there's a multitude of ways to manage discomfort, as you know personally. There's a multitude of ways at home. Just being at home is a way to manage discomfort, and not being in a hospital setting for some people is a really great way to manage that discomfort.
And I found that, you know, I think there's this fantasy that there is a way to manage discomfort in a way that, for me at least, has been unrealistic. Like hypnobirthing and techniques and this, like, I think with my first birth, I had this expectation that those were going to manage, and I'm not even going to call it discomfort, I'm going to call it pain. And I think that there's like a real aversion to using the P word, but I'm just going to use it because I kind of had an incredible experience of feeling like, oh, I shouldn't be feeling this much pain. with my first one. And then second time around, I was like, well, that's for me, that's the experience. That's the level of sensation that I'm getting. And second time around, feeling safe, being in an environment that made me feel safe, being with people that made me feel safe, and being with people that I trusted. If there was something wrong, I trusted their judgment to see that way before there was an emergency and make sure that I got somewhere where I would be treated properly. And so being able to let go and not being afraid, it was a pretty incredible experience to just feel pain and not be afraid of it. And that's like, I don't know, that's something I'll just drop there for people, is like, yes, you want to manage the sensations, and then also maybe it's an experience where you just also accept the sensations.
So what you're talking about is, I don't have an aversion at all to using the word pain. And in birth or contractions, I think that it's a legitimate contraction. It's what's happening. If people want to call it surges, I'm happy to call it a surge or a wave, but it is a contraction. Your muscle is contracting and there is pain. And sometimes when we are so afraid of calling it pain, it's, to me, like you said, I agree with you. There's kind of this, it's almost like you're lying to yourself and you're saying, when something doesn't feel good, the brain is registering that there is something that's not feeling good. What's in our power is to know that that discomfort and that pain means that something optimal is happening. And that may be the only time in our whole history as humans that pain is actually positive, that the discomfort means progression, that those contractions and the sensations that we're feeling actually mean that this human being is going to be in your arms soon. And because if we don't have it, we don't get there. So it's the relating with the discomfort. It's sitting in those uncomfortable moments and being able to be like, I feel the sensation. And sometimes we can reroute that sensation, like holding combs can help, or having pressure points. This is why I spend so much of my time squeezing hips, and so much of my time, I mean, the positions that I am in sometimes are comical. Like, I've had my hands under the water in someone having a home birth, holding they're sitting on my fists, their sits bones are there, and that's the only thing that helped her until she pushed her baby out, and I'm like under there. So whatever works, we practice all those things before we get to the party so that we have that toolbox. And sometimes none work and sometimes they do. So it's less about the aversion to the pain, and it's more like you said, how am I going to interact with it? What does it have for me? What's on the other side? What happens if I actually walk toward it instead of recoil away from it? What's on the other side of it? So that's where the pre-work, all the preliminary work has to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
That even comes from having really challenging conversations with your partner and your family members. Being in that uncomfortable position to say, this is the birth that I'm claiming for myself. There's pain there. There's emotional pain. What happens when we actually invite it in and we don't call it good or bad? And we realize that it's part of me being in my human body. It's part of me being the matrix for Mother Nature to expand herself through. So that's what's really exciting to me when we start to realize, and that's in motherhood too, instead of feeling like, oh, motherhood is such a bitch and it's so hard. Yeah, it's the hardest thing you'll ever do in your life, but it's the most amazing. So I can hold those contrasts, and I'm practicing it in birth. Everything I'm practicing in birth, I'm going to use in motherhood, because I'm going to be able to hold the light and dark. I'm going to be able to hold the deepest pain and still rise from it. And so, yeah, went off on another tangent, but 100% the way that we relate to the discomfort is everything.
And I think it's just really, again, finding your safety, and that looks different for everyone, but it's finding those people you feel safe with, because I think it makes all the difference in feeling those sensations. And I think it's such a cool human experience to have very intense pain and at the same time feel very safe. And like you are in just the exact place you should be experiencing that. Like we never get to have that. And it does something to you. It leaves this lasting, very cool impact that you have for life after that.
Yeah, I mean, and you can think of your daughter, like your daughter, I don't know how old she is, but what's she, like 4?
She's 3.
Oh, she's 3. So if she falls and hurts herself and she turns around and looks at you, because that's what they do. They always like look at us to see our response. And you're like, oh my gosh, tears will just run. But if you acknowledge, you don't just say like, you're okay, but you acknowledge and you say, you comfort, the child then starts to feel like, okay, I'm safe. I'm safe. I hurt myself, but I'm safe. And I have people to nurture me. That's what we're modeling in the way that in the care that we're looking for is how we're going to be able to model the care that we're giving. So we want that empathy. We want the people to be there. We deserve it. You deserve to be heard and to be seen and to be acknowledged. When we don't listen to someone that's feeling something, when we're ignoring what they're saying, when we're ignoring that they're saying, I know there's something inside that feels this way, that's really problematic. So again, everything comes back to do the work before you get there. Do the work, unpack those traumas and sit with a practitioner that's willing to hold that those talks with you. I don't know how long is your visit with your OB? Do they put you on a scale, or do they ask you, what are you eating? What do you eat for breakfast? What do you eat for lunch? Let's talk about nutrition. Do they say, what's showing up for you in birth? Like, how are you born? How are you born? What do you feel like? How do you envision? How do you want to push? How do you think you're going to feel? Are these questions, are these conversations that you're having with your practitioner? Because that matters.
Really does. Okay, so there's a lot that I wanted to ask around induction and 42 weeks and 40 weeks and due dates, and there's a lot there, but I think what I will do is, because I want to end on a last note that I think you can really share a lot of wisdom and give something special to people tuning in about this. But I want to say that everybody should just go find you and look at your work and talk to you and work with you and hear much more around due dates and induction and how long we gestate and why there are these cutoff times. I think there's a lot there. So I'm going to invite people to really tune in with you. And I know that you share a lot there. But I wanted to end with, we had a lot of moms that are looking for ways to heal grief after a birth. Some women are really still struggling with grief 18 months, 2 years later. And I heard from a lot of women that either didn't feel present to their pregnancy and didn't feel present in their birth, or women that had a C-section and don't feel like they're back in their body 2 years later. All different ways, but feeling grief for a birth, and how do we heal that and look at that? And
I think that it is really important to share our stories. When we share our stories, we heal. When we hold space to hear someone's story without having to put a bow on it at the end or fix it or make it sound pretty because it's making us feel uncomfortable. When we actually let someone own their grief and own their own experience and process their trauma, that's where the healing begins. And it kind of goes back to that idea of we're really uncomfortable with some of that discomfort. We need to learn to be able to hold space for that. So that is definitely something that I do with clients, I do with students. We do that in my integration program and the postnatal program that I lead online. We share our birth stories without commenting on them or applauding them, you know. And there's been times where I get messages after and a mother will say, "Thank you so much. I just even telling my story without having, you know, just without having anyone comment on it or anything, just sending love, that I really started the healing process." And I wrote a letter, and I wrote a letter to my doula, and I wrote a letter. Um, and it's the first step toward healing. And I really highly recommend you find, if you're someone who is going through that and that's been ignited, even just by you watching other births or hearing other people's birth story, find someone to share it with. You know, there's another woman here in Los Angeles. She has a company called Life After Birth. And she holds space for a lot of people to do the healing work. But if you're going to be pregnant again, or if you are pregnant again, and you did have a traumatic experience the first time around, sometimes you'll even find you book the same doctor and you start doing everything the same. And that sometimes is a trauma response. And so we have to do the work of breaking it down and telling our story. And even if you do the whole thing of telling it and you choose to work with that doctor again, that's okay. But let it come out of you and let it have its place and honor it and let yourself have tears and reverence over it. Because even though it is there for your growth, because everything on our path is there for our growth, the dark and the light is there for our expansion and our growth. It doesn't mean it's not heartbreaking. It doesn't mean that loss isn't heartbreaking. It doesn't mean that the way that we wish our birth would have gone isn't really sad. And instead of blame, we learn to forgive ourselves. We learn to forgive those who were at the level of consciousness and they did what they did. Because if we hold that, we continue to poison ourselves and we continue to go in that loop. And so I think it's a place that needs to be held for people, as with miscarriage, with loss, with stillbirth, with birth trauma. We have to start hearing the stories and holding space for them, and definitely doing the work before we get to the next birth.
And Patti, how can they be with you and work with you? I know there's a myriad of ways. Can you break that down for everyone?
Yes. My company is Uma Mother, and Uma Mothers was born about 7 years ago, and it was the product of many, many, many years of teaching yoga and being pregnant and having my children and being a doula and being a meditation teacher. And so Uma Mother is there as a home space for us to expand our consciousness through practices like yoga, like meditation, like what we're doing here. I'm a huge educator. I love educating. I don't like telling people what's right for them. I like to put the education in their hands and let them make the decisions. So Uma Mother is going to be launched as an app very soon in early 2023, in February, hopefully. And it's a long gestation of many years of work that I've been doing. And it'll be available online as an app where you can take classes for all the stages of, preconception, prenatal, postnatal, before, beyond, where you can learn more Vedic knowledge through knowledge talks. And if you want to learn Vedic meditation, you can connect with me personally. And what's really exciting about that platform is it's going to be a place where I can showcase all the experts that I'm so lucky to work with. I can't close this conversation without honoring the mentors and the teachers that I've had in the Los Angeles community, who have raised me as a doula and as a stand-in midwife and as the mother that I am, as a single mother that I am. So Uma Mother's all of that. It brings all of those different avenues of love and life that I've experienced into a platform that is there. And because I am Colombian and my culture and is very dear to me, I will be having all of that available in Spanish, hopefully in the next generation of the company, so that Spanish speaking mothers can also benefit from all of this information. So you could find me at umamother.com.
Okay. And by the time we are hearing this, your app should be live.
Oh, great. So
really
hold me to my word. I've said sometimes, I'm like, someone's just gonna have to pull this baby out of me, because I'm so busy with everyone else's births that I haven't tended to this baby that really needs to be born soon. But it's really exciting to me. I feel like it's a really exciting time. I want every mother out there who gets overwhelmed with what's happening in this world. It's horrible. How are we bringing children in? I want to invite you to upgrade your consciousness and realize that nature is very intelligent, and that it's the babies that are coming in that are awakening all of this knowledge within us. So our work is to connect with nature and to be the lighthouse and to continue to expand your consciousness every day as best you can.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.